Good morning, everyone. It's about 5:30, which is a great time to be awake. I actually woke up about an hour ago, which has been my new norm. Like, no matter how late I go to bed, I find that I always wake up around 4:30. And I'm still learning how to meditate. So, and find the motivation to actually get up from bed and maybe stretch a little bit, or find the motivation to journal, because I've gotten really good in my life at ruminating and just kind of laying and sitting in my thoughts even though they don't feel great. So that's something that I'm working on. But this morning I sat up for a second and was listening to the dogs snore, and that was my meditation, and it felt really good. And I also stretched for a little bit, like a couple minutes, and I just stretched in bed, which was great. And I've been massaging myself, which also feels really, really good. It's just like bringing my awareness into my body. Also found the motivation to journal a little bit, to get whatever was in my mind onto paper. So I'm really proud of myself. I feel like I'm really starting this day off pretty stinking great. Starting new habits. Okay, so one thing that I was talking with someone that I know, and she had mentioned that she started to implement in her family, like how can we support the different versions of ourselves like throughout the day. And so she has these little kids and her husband, and they started to like implement like, what would our nighttime self, like how could we support our nighttime self, like if you're thinking about maybe like eating past a certain time and it keeps you up all night, or I don't know, certain habits that we have, or at night, like how can we support our morning selves, or like if it's eating dairy. Like for me, when I eat dairy, I've noticed that like my belly just like swells. I just get really uncomfortable because my body can't process the dairy like that. And so it's like when I go to do something, it's like, how can I support my future self? Like, how can I support my afternoon self or whatever? So I was thinking about that. You could think about that, take it, use it. It's really nice. Is like in these moments, like, how can we support our future selves? Is this the best thing? So as I've been journaling, some things had come up that I felt that I wanted to share, because as you know, in my last video, I have been working on this like anger and resentment and things that are coming up for me whenever I talk to a certain individual about a certain topic. It's really interesting, and I'm so grateful to that individual. I haven't expressed yet how grateful I am, but I definitely will, because I'm realizing just what is stuck within myself. And a few things that had come up that were scratching the surface to bring to my awareness was just like this idea in general of stress management and coping. And I'm going to be looking at my journal a little bit. I don't have it organized, so I may sit around and kind of like look into what is in there. But so I realized that in having that conversation, those topics were actually triggering a stress response within me, which was triggering that fight or flight or flee like feeling, which all of those emotions were just validating, right? So in that moment when I felt like I was disassociating and I wasn't focused on this individual. And then I kind of went down the rabbit hole last night of watching like what like red flags for an emotionally like unstable, I don't know, person. And I was like, I actually do kind of a few of those things, you know? And it was interesting because sometimes I feel like these videos are like shaming people that are like red flags with an emotionally toxic person, you know? And I feel like, wow, like these could actually be kind of like more detrimental to some people than they are helpful, because I feel like if we are demonstrating like people who are victims to like toxic relationships, they're also contributing in one way or another with a toxic behavior. Like I will fully admit that I have some toxic behaviors, especially in relationships, you know, like things that you learn growing up and that like I'm fully working on wanting to transform. But I just want to say to all of you who might like watch some of these videos to like do work on yourself to get help, where you feel like, oh my gosh, like I'm totally that person. Like sometimes I've even asked myself, I'm like, am I the narcissist? Like, oh my golly. And then I feel all this like shame that starts to come up. And then last night I was like, you know what? Yeah, I am. Like, I do demonstrate toxic behaviors. And that's okay because I'm working through it. Like, it's not cool. And it's not fun to be the person that might demonstrate some toxic behaviors. Because it's like painful inside, you know? Like, you don't know what's going on and you just want to be happy and healthy. And you see all these people who are just super happy and healthy, that have the best relationships. So, like, if you ever find yourself where you're like, oh my gosh, like, am I that person? Like, yeah, you know what? Like, own it and just be like, you know what? Yeah, I demonstrate toxic behaviors and I'm working on it. I'm a work in progress, just like everyone else in the world. So, fully, you know what? Own it. Who cares? Like, as long as you're definitely not like hurting people, like intentionally, like on a level of just like, okay, there, I think there's a spectrum, and I think it's one thing to like recognize and acknowledge, but it's not okay to like intentionally hurt people by any means. So that's not what I'm saying at all. Anyway, I went on a tangent, but I realized that my coping mechanisms sometimes, like in my mind, we'll take this example. When I was with that individual, all I was thinking about was, I don't want him to think that the reason why this is coming up is because of him, because it has nothing to do with him. Really, like this conversation, whatever energetically is happening, is sparking something within me, bringing it to my awareness that I have to deal with. The response that I chose was, I apologize. My mind's a little crazy, a little out there. I feel like I can't focus on what you're saying, and I'm so uncomfortable right now. I feel like I have to leave. And I left. Now, some would say, okay, that's healthy, like to separate yourself from the situation, to collect yourself, yada yada. Just by the way, I'm also not looking at the camera thing, which right now I feel like you might think, okay, she's looking me in the eyes. I'm looking at my screen. So if you see me just like going back and forth or just looking elsewhere, I'm looking at the screen, by the way. But I realized that I actually like it. The very thing that maybe I was trying to avoid, and not, I mean, and this is like in not expressing the details of it, but feeling in that moment like, okay, I just need to separate myself because I don't want him to think that it's about him, could actually, especially for somebody with like a natural codependent nature, where, because I know that this happened to me, where like if you're so entangled with somebody, because I always like to think of like how are my actions affecting other people, that could leave somebody kind of like ruminating and thinking like, what did I do, when really in that moment you're like, I just need to get out of here, and it has nothing to do with them. So I recognize that like, okay, maybe the very thing that I wanted to avoid is like the thing that I was actually doing, because I didn't want to make the conversation about me. I wanted to be able to support them, but I just couldn't. So then I felt like if I brought up like, hey, I'm feeling really uncomfortable right now in this moment, that it would make it about me, and I didn't want to do that. Like, that wasn't my intention. But in walking away, I just made it about me, because they weren't able to finish what they were saying. I just made it about me because I couldn't handle, because it was like whatever was coming up. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I was like, well, what if I did take a minute to just be like, hey, this is really interesting. Like, what's coming up for me is like a lot of discomfort. And then I recognized, like, I played out the scenario in my mind, if I were to say like, and this is what's coming up is like resentment, anger from like, I don't know, decisions that I haven't made in the past, or like power that I've given away to other people, thinking that they knew better than me, like what was best for me, and like all these things that were coming up in that moment. And then, like validating, it has nothing to do with you. I think this is really interesting that this is coming up, and I apologize, I don't want to make this about you or about me, but I feel like I just need to validate this part of myself right now and acknowledge that I am feeling this way, and apologize to you, because I mean, this is like, I want to support you in this moment. And just in doing that, we're opening up not only vulnerability, right? So we're being vulnerable with this other person about like, okay, this is actually creating something in me, but you're opening up conversation as well for it to go to a deeper conversation, which would only deepen your friendship. And yeah, I would say like it's creating that connection piece. So when we can be vulnerable, we're allowing ourselves to have connection. We're actually opening our hearts to other people. When we walk away, and I think it's one thing to walk away to collect yourself, to like then come back and be like, hey, I'm so sorry, like I just needed a minute to like understand, to gain clarity. I needed to separate myself from a situation where I just felt like I couldn't navigate the emotions, I couldn't navigate the energy, like I didn't understand. But if we walk away and we don't ever acknowledge that exchange, then we're almost like we're pushing people away. And especially if we're not doing this reflection work to even acknowledge that stuff within ourselves, we are rejecting that part of ourselves, which brings me to another topic that I just understood so much more profoundly, was in self-expression and validation. And I feel in general circumstances, I am not a therapist or a psychologist or anything. This is just all like what I talk about on here is just like things that I'm recognizing within myself, and things that maybe could help. In normal, safe circumstances, expressing ourselves for like how we're feeling is so profound. I mean, even if that person does not see it your way, or if that person doesn't react in a way that's ideal, right? Like if we have expectations and they don't meet those, whatever, that person doesn't have to agree with the way that you feel about something. But if we are honoring ourselves enough to express how we're feeling, that is validating yourself. That is accepting yourself. That's loving yourself. Like when we walk away from situations because we want to avoid conflict, which I've done 1,000 times, and throughout my life, like I've done that so many times. I'm only just understanding what it means to validate myself and to express myself. But I just seen so clearly when we don't, like when we're just like, okay, I'm going to walk away because that's safer. Because then I don't have to have this conversation that's maybe one, uncomfortable, two, that would threaten, maybe, right, these perceived threats that would threaten this relationship because of X, Y, and Z. Like this is meeting a need of like safety and security or whatever. So like even understanding our own needs and how we project those needs onto other people can be something to work on. But when we're not expressing ourselves, regardless of the response of others, we are rejecting ourselves. And so I found that to be interesting. And speaking of a perceived threat, I recognize that the reason why I got so angry and why I was feeling these like triggers was because there was a perceived threat. Oddly, like I felt threatened, and then there was this stress response. Like I seen this like pattern happen like within just a split second. It was like there was a topic that was really sensitive to me because I wasn't feeling worthy in certain topics. Or I mean, that's a root of feeling unworthiness. But in these topics that he was talking about specifically are areas that I feel like I've struggled with and have an unhealthy relationship with, that I'm working on attaining a healthier relationship with. So in doing that, I think subconsciously there was a perceived threat, which then triggered a stress response, which then sent all of those, just that response throughout the body that told me like, you just need to get out of here. So long story short, validate yourself, talk about things, and be vulnerable with other people, and recognize that I feel like if we could manage our stress, like our stress responses, I feel like if we can just start, even if we don't understand what's going on within us and we just feel all over the place and we feel chaotic, like do find ways that work for you to help manage stress. Like just imagine all of those moments where you feel like triggered or just like uncontrollable, or like your mind just keeps going and going. Find a list of like ways to manage stress and just do some of those things on the list, because I guarantee it's because you've had a stress response. Like it's just a fight, flight, freeze response to a perceived threat that maybe you're feeling subconsciously. And that just really blew my mind. I had no idea. I'm learning something new about myself. So I think that's it. And I hope this helps. Love you. Bye.